Okay. Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Elliot Stapleton. I'm with the Camas Public Library. I'm really excited that you could all join for tonight's event, Introduction to Pollinators and Home Habitat Assessment. Our presentation is given by Dave Kollen. We're very excited to have Dave back. Dave gave another talk with the library, which was co-hosted by Naturescaping of Southwest Washington. And we really enjoyed the program so much that we asked Dave back for another event. So the event is going to be, the presentation is going to be roughly an hour and a half with a break in the middle. I just want to let people know that there will be an opportunity to ask questions, but we'll wait for questions until the end of Dave's presentation. You can ask questions through chat. You can also use the raise hand icon at the bottom of your Zoom window at the end of the presentation to ask your question out loud. So I'm really excited. I want to give a couple, some information about Dave. Dave Kollen is a Xerces Society ambassador and a certified master melittologist. In addition, he performs community science work by conducting surveys for several different bee atlas projects, including the Pacific Northwest Bumble Bee Atlas. So I'm gonna turn things over to Dave, and I'm really looking forward to the talk. So over to you, Dave.
Okay, hello everybody. I'm gonna pretend I can see your faces. Today we're gonna be talking about pollinators I'm going to be, and home habitat assessment. There's a lot of material in here. And I'm going to move through, relatively quickly. So fasten your seat belts, but as Elliot said, there's time for questions afterwards. So I want to talk a little bit about the Cersei Society first. Xerces was named after the Xerces blue butterfly. The Xerces blue is the first butterfly known to go extinct due to activities of man. The picture here is a very close relative called a Fender's blue. And Xerces was started in 1971 after this butterfly was declared extinct. And so for 50 years, the society has been working to help conserve invertebrates. Now, why do you think we care about invertebrates? Well, as E.O. Wilson said, they're the little creatures that run the world. And we rely on services that are, really run in the background, but decomposition of organic materials. There's a lot of biocontrol that goes on. Of course, invertebrates are part of many food chains. And maybe as important as any of those are the pollination services that we get. And Xerces works to achieve this mission through outreach activities like I'm doing right now, also conservation and advocacy work. Xerces has over 17,000 members in 15 countries, and we work with scientists from around the world and also collaborate with dozens of federal, state, and local agencies such as Washington Wildlife, the USDA, etc. We also help land managers and farmers that want to improve their habitat to support pollinators. So before talking about the pollinators, just a quick little review. Most of you probably remember this from school days, but pollination is simply the act of moving pollen from the stamen of a flower to the pistil. And you can see on the inset picture where those parts of the flower are, in case you don't remember that. And I just want to point out this bee in the picture is on a sunflower. Sunflowers are what's called a composite flower. And so even though we call it a sunflower, it is in fact many, many flowers. And the little, let me try my laser pointer here. These little black cylinders are actually the flowers that actually the stamens wrapped around. So the flowers are here, and you can see all of these are individual flowers, and these are flowers that haven't opened up yet. So plants have various strategies to get pollinated if they need it. Insects make up 85% of the pollinators. Vertebrates such as bats and a few other oddballs maybe are 1%, and then water and wind are about 14%. And importantly, most cereals that we eat are wind pollinated plants. So why do we care about pollinators? Well, we care about them because 85% of plants, as we just showed, require a pollinator to successfully set seed and have follow-on generations. These plants provide us with roughly 1 in 3 mouthfuls of food and drink that we consume. Globally, there's 1,200 crops that rely on pollinators. The value of that pollination in the US alone is in the tens of billions of dollars. These figures are actually a little bit dated, and several hundred billion probably by now globally. Some years back, Whole Foods went to and tried to show their customers how important pollinators are. If you look at this picture, this is a produce department, and you'll see it's stocked full of produce. And when they took away the produce that relied on pollinators, you can see there's a lot of gaps. Most of what's remaining are citrus, because citrus is one of the families of plants that are they call them self-fruitful. Some apples and Bartlett pears are in the same category. But you can say see that there's a devastating hit to the produce department. On the dairy side, this is a dairy freezer, not freezer, but a cooler, loaded up. And after taking away foods that rely on pollinators, this is what's left. And you might think, why would dairy rely on pollinators? Well, of course, if you think about it, it's the feed for the cattle. And most dairy cattle are fed alfalfa along with some other things. And alfalfa requires pollinators to set seed. And in fact, it requires pollinators other than honeybees that we're so familiar with. So another thing that pollinators do is they support other wildlife. Through pollination services, we have seeds and fruits on plants. And of course, those are important for a lot of animals. And even grizzly bears get into the act. There's a moth called a miller moth, and in the daytime, they congregate under large rocks. And when a grizzly is trying to fatten up for the winter hibernation, they overturn these rocks and they start gobbling up miller moths. Now, a miller moth maybe is a half a calorie of food, but a grizzly will eat up to 40,000 of these in a day. And so they can gain 20,000 calories off of miller moths. And of course, many of the birds are insectivorous, and they'll eat pollinators among other things. And of course, we get other things besides food, our springtime flowers, our Halloween pumpkins, and maybe more important than anything, to me anyway, Thanksgiving pie. Now I'd like to talk a little bit about pollinator diversity. There are 6 main groups of pollinators, insect pollinators. If we start at the upper left and go clockwise, we have a butterfly, a moth, a fly, a bumblebee, a wasp, and a beetle. Now, of these, the most important pollinator by far is the bumblebee, or any bees. And the reason that they're the most important is bees show 3 distinctive behaviors. Number one, and this especially applies to the females, they are collecting and transporting pollen. So they're in the business of gathering pollen and taking it back to either their colonies or their individual nest cells. Other pollinators butterflies, moths, they are not taking pollen as a food. What they're doing is dispersing it by chance, and they may not hit the same flowers when they do that, and they may not carry very much around. They also forage in the area around their nest, and they exhibit something called flower constancy. And what flower constancy is it's a tendency in general for bees on a foraging trip to keep going to the same type of flower. Now, I don't really have time to explain why that is, but you just trust me that that's a true statement in general. And by going to the same type of flower, that helps deliver pollen from one plant to another in the same species. If you have a case of a butterfly that, say, is on a daisy and then hops over to an aster, well, daisy pollen is not going to do the aster any good. It's got to be the same species. Now, honeybees are probably the most familiar bees for all of us, but they are far from typical. Honeybees, number one, they're not native. Number two, they live in large colonies, typically 20,000 individuals, and it could even go, up to say 50,000. And they create honey, as we know, and that honey allows the hive to survive over the winter. And all of our other bees don't have that capability. They cannot live through a winter as a collective group. So honeybees, they're really important. They're important for crop pollination. They're important for our honey. But we're really not going to talk about them today. I'm going to focus on native bees. So the majority of native bees are solitary bees. That means they live on their own. They're not part of a colony. They're very gentle, and they're unlikely to sting. Unlike colonial species, they're not protecting a colony and its assets. When they're out on a flower, they're not going to protect that flower. If you go up close to that bee and chase it away, it's not going to come back and fight you for that flower. That's just not the way they work. So it's very hard to get them to sting. You'd actually have to squeeze one. So I'd like to say something about the diversity of species of bees. In the US and Canada, that is north of Mexico in North America, there's roughly an estimated 4,000 species of bees. In Oregon and Washington, we're about the same. There's, say, 600 to 800 species as an estimated number. A city the size of Portland, maybe 80 to 100 species there. And in a single yard with some good pollinator habitat, you might see 20 to 30 species, different species of bees if you really know what you're watching for. Now, these are some Oregon bees. They're also, they're going to be bees in your part of Washington. And I'm not going to go through these, but I just want you to look just for a little bit and look at how varied they are, in the coloration and body shapes. These are not sized to scale, so you can't really see that. But we know really very little about the distribution of most of these species. And there are projects going on that are trying to increase our understanding of where these species are in the state and even what species we have. Because as I said, we have these estimated numbers, but we don't really know for sure. Now, one of the things that's very diverse in bees is the size of bees. And this picture shows the largest and smallest bees that you find in the US. So the big one is something called a valley carpenter bee. And next to it, superimposed on it, is something called a fairy bee. And if you think about this, the amazing thing is that you could easily fit 3 of those fairy bees inside one eye of this carpenter bee. And these carpenter bees are maybe up to 1.25 inches long. That's a tremendous difference in size. Another thing that varies widely is just coloration and patterns and how much hair they have or don't have. You see these shiny metallic bees that can be all green or blue or black. On the lower right, you've got this really hairy looking thing. That's actually a leafcutter bee that's called a fuzzy-legged leafcutter bee, and this is a male of the species. And on the left, we've got a nocturnal bee. Not strictly nocturnal, but if it's night and there's a bright moon, they can do some foraging. And if you notice, the eyes look huge compared to the rest of the head. And in fact, there's anatomical differences in the eyes of these bees that allow them to see roughly 30 times as well in dark environments as a regular bee. Another form of diversity is just in the behavior of bees. We've got nectar robbers, they're called, and this example here is a carpenter bee, and they basically cheat the flower because the flower makes an agreement. I'm using this terminology, that where the flower provides some nectar and the bee comes in and it gets that nectar and also gets pollen, whether it's trying to get pollen or not. It's very important. Because as I said earlier, sometimes they're there to collect the pollen, but sometimes they're just there to nectar. And in this case, this bee's tongue is not long enough to get into the flower all the way. And it says, okay, well, I'm going to cheat. I'm going to go cut a hole down where the nectar is and not take any pollen. I've got a couple of cuckoo bees. The one in the middle is called a social parasite, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. And on the far right is a cuckoo bee that's known as a brood parasite. And what brood parasites do is they sneak around and they wait for a bee, one of these solitary bees, to leave its nest. And they'll sneak in there and lay their egg on the food storage. And sometimes they'll even go kill the egg of the other bee. And so that's the way they make their life. And they don't bother gathering pollen or anything like that. So there's a scientist named Stephen Buckman, and he likened a female bee to a flying Swiss Army knife and noted that they've got a whole toolkit for gathering, manipulating, and transporting products for nest construction and larval provisioning. That means feeding the eggs or creating a ball for the eggs to feed on, I should say. So when we look at the gathering part, okay, one of the things they gather, as I said earlier, they gather pollen. You can see this bee is just covered in pollen. Another thing they gather is nest materials. So here we've got a picture of a bee that is pulling hair off of a leaf. This is lamb's ear, if you're familiar with that. And then on the far right, this is just a picture of a bumblebee gathering nectar. As far as manipulation goes, we start on the left-hand side, we see a trowel. This is just a little hard plate at the end of the abdomen on certain bees called a pygidial plate. They use that to tamp down the soil when they're building nests in soil. The next picture shows a brush, basically the tongue. Now, this species of bee uses this tongue to line their nest with a cellophane-like material that they actually excrete in their mouths, and they wipe that on the inside, and it makes it sealed against moisture and some microbes. The next picture over shows a leafcutter bee, and this is just to show that there's a wide variation in the mandibles on bees, and some of them are very effective scissors. And then finally, we see a rake known as a rastellum, and these little combs right along here are used to comb the pollen into a lump. And where that lump goes, so now we're talking about transporting. some bees have got a structure called a corbicula. And the corbicula is this little yellow dot. This is actually pollen and a little bit of nectar to hold it together. And it's in a depression on the leg of that bee, that bumblebee. So not all bees have this, but certain ones do. Another way that they carry pollen is something called a scopa. And a scopa is a brush of hair. Typically, it's on the hind leg right here, but it can be on other parts of the body. And in fact, here we see a leafcutter bee, and they tend to hold their abdomens up because their scopa is on the underside of their abdomen. And you can see this is just packed with pollen. Finally, before going on, I do want to point out that wasps are not bees. So this yellow jacket, the way we know that they're not bees is wasps tend to have no hair. So if you look at one of these up close, no hair showing. And although we can't see the hind leg very well, the hind leg on a bee tends to be pretty thick, especially at the top. And wasps have little chicken legs. They also hold their wings out, whereas a bee will tend to fold them over their abdomen when they're at rest. And when you see one of these, don't just grab the can of Raid if you don't have to. They do an important job. They kill a lot of insects that are pests in our gardens. So now I want to talk a little bit about the natural history of bees. And what natural history means is how do they make a living? So I'm going to start this by talking about the solitary bee life cycle. Solitary bees, as this mining bee here in the picture, they only spend 2 to 4 weeks as an adult. That's their whole lifetime outside of the ground, or if they're tunnel nesters, outside of a stem or a wood tunnel somewhere. So when this female emerges, she's going to go and start building nests. And we see here a nest. This is a ball of pollen that she's provisioned. So she's maybe made many trips to gather this. She's dug the nest. She's going to lay an egg on it. And after 1 to 3 weeks, that egg's going to hatch. 6 to 8 weeks later, we have a full larva, and it's going to go into a pupal stage. And it's going to remain 8 to 9 months in the ground, in this case, and then later on, pop out again. So a very short lifetime out in the open. And there's always some exceptions to what I'm telling you, but in general, this is how this works. So roughly 70% of our native bees are ground nesters. And if you walk into a lawn, you'll see a lot of times they look like little anthills. And they really like kind of a sandy soil so they can dig pretty easily. And it's a good reason to have some of this soil around. It's good if you have this kind of soil. The underground structures that they build can be very varied. The last picture, we just saw a single nest cell. Sometimes there's fingers, and each one of these here is a single cell. Sometimes you got these very complex architectures going on, and there's many more variations besides this, depending on species. The other 30% of our natives, solitary bees, are tunnel nesters. So they nest in wood tunnels. That could be a hollow stem. And if they're digging in a hollow, not digging, but building a nest in a hollow stem, they'll either line it with nest leaf material, or they'll use mud. So in this case, each one of these represents an individual nest cell. They're separated from each other with a wall of leaves, and there's going to be an egg and a pollen provision in each one of these. We call these bee bread sometimes. This lower illustration is a mason bee of some kind. They use mud and they create these partitions. Again, they're going to put down pollen and lay an egg on it, seal that up, create another one, and they just keep going out until the end of the stem. Sometimes I'll do this in beetle holes in something like this snag. So nest materials, you know, this picture here shows an example of that leaf cutter that I showed you earlier that was cutting a circular piece of leaf out. Well, this is what happens to this leaf. In this case, it's going into an underground nest. And besides leaves, they're going to collect soil, resin, and other things for their nest. Some bees are a little, you know, even more different in the way they do things. Some will use pebbles. So they'll take resins that are sticky resins out of plants, and they will use those resins to hold pebbles together. And this is actually their nest. They're pretty, you know, hard to find out in the open. I've never seen one. There's a species of bee called Nosmia that like to use snail shells. And so if we opened up this snail shell, we'd see some of these nest partitions in here. And then finally, if you remember that bee that was scraping up fibers off that lamb's ear, this is what it's going to end up doing with those. This is a nest made completely out of leaf fuzz, basically. Building nests is really hard work. So typically a ground nesting bee will build a nest that's around a foot deep. You know, it varies, but roughly something like that. There's one species of bee that build nests up to 10 feet deep. It's in very arid environments where this happens. And to put this in perspective, if you think about it, let's say that this is a 1-inch long bee, which is a pretty large bee. That 10 feet would be like us digging a hole down 600 to 700 feet deep. The leafcutter bees, they put together these, you know, very complex cells. And sometimes they use over 20 different pieces to put these together. And they've got to be cut to precise dimensions. So, you know, this bee is really thinking about what it's bringing back. And, you know, that's a lot of trips. There's a lot of work in doing this. Some bees, you know, if you look at how much pollen you might ask it, say, you know, how much pollen can a bee carry? Well, that varies by how they're carrying the pollen, obviously, and how big they are. So how many trips do they make? Well, that depends on. The top bee here is called a masked bee. And this little bubble here is actually nectar and pollen. And this bee is going to swallow this. And these are very tiny little bees. It's going to swallow that, put it in a little internal crop, and fly back to the nest with that. So this is a, you know, real limitation. That's not a whole lot being carried at one time. This bee, on the other hand, on the bottom's got this huge scopal load, and, you know, maybe doesn't have to make as many trips. So the number of trips taken can go from a few to, you know, tens of trips, 20 or 30 different trips, just to make a single one of those bee bread loaves that I talked about. Now I want to talk a little bit about the honeybee life cycle. And we're going to start out here just at the end of winter. Honeybee queens, they're called gynes at this stage. They go and hibernate. They'll either go into dig maybe a real shallow little burrow. They're not very good diggers, or they'll go under a bunch of leaves. And this is a good reason for you to leave your leaves around from the fall into spring. They'll get up after hibernation, you know, late winter, early spring. They'll start feeding. They've got to restore their own reserves because they've run down a lot of their reserves. And then they're going to search for a place to build a colony. That could be a hollow section of a log or something like that. They really like using abandoned rodent nests because most of the time they already have insulation in them. And so the queen's going to start out, this little thing here is called a honey pot. She's going to go and fill that with nectar. She's going to gather a bunch of pollen. She's going to lay eggs on it. And she's going to basically be brooding those cells just like a bird does. And over time, the larvae are going to grow. And after 5 to 6 weeks, she's going to start having some helpers. The first eggs or the first larvae will have developed into adults. And so at this point, she's not going to leave the colony anymore. It's always dangerous business to go outside. And throughout the summer, the colony will continue to increase in size. And at some stage, what's called colony changeover is going to occur. And that's when she's going to stop producing workers and start producing reproductives. And somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 to 15 weeks, these reproductives will hatch and they'll leave the nest. And at this time, we have the possibility of having offspring going into the next generation. If anything occurs, anything bad happens during this time here, that's a nest failure and there's nothing left over. No survivors. So the mated queen is going to go find a place to hibernate. Cycle starts all over again. Now, if you remember, I talked about a cuckoo bee that was a bumblebee. And what they do is they come out a little bit later, and sometime in the spring, they will go, and about this stage where a normal bumblebee nest is starting to have some workers, she is bigger, stronger, well-armored. She'll invade this nest. She will either kill or subdue the queen and then start laying her own eggs. And she's going to force these workers to basically take care of her eggs. She never bothers to go and gather pollen or anything like that. And the rest of the cycle is the same, only she has basically taken over another nest. So bumblebees, they like to use existing cavities, as I said, old rodent holes or dens being especially attractive. They like these kind of untidy areas, long grass. Some bumblebees actually will build their nest in grass tussocks. And places like this also provide a winter shelter for butterflies and other insects. So if we look at the habitat needs of bees, they'll drink nectar from almost any flower, as long as it's not toxic to them. And that does happen sometimes. But when it comes to pollen, they're very much more particular. And in some cases, there are specialist bees that will really only take pollen from either a single species or a small group of related species. Now, I want to just say a little bit about flowers here so that you can be aware of the diversity of flowers and what that implies for bees. So, let's look at this bee here on the left, number 9. A short little tongue. This is a mining bee. And if you look at the flowers, well, we could figure out probably pretty comfortable going around this flower, probably this one. There's no way in heck it's going to be able to handle this flower here because the nectar's way up in here. It could potentially get some pollen here. But look at this bee number 10. It's got this huge, long tongue. So it's going to do better on a deeper flower, like these, maybe the pen stem in here. And this bumblebee, I've got this up here because if we look at this plant down here, number 5, this is a lupin or a pea family. And they tend to be very hard. Their pollen is delivered with a little hidden plunger. And the bee's got to basically push down on the keel here and open this thing up, and then the pollen will come out. And you got to be very strong. So bumblebees are one of the few bees that are strong enough to do this. Smaller bees don't stand a chance. I'll talk a little bit about butterflies here. So butterflies and bees have, very similar life characteristics, but the major difference is nesting versus host plants. So as we've seen, bees build nests, and butterflies, they use host plants. So they lay their eggs directly on their preferred host plant. And so we distinguish between nectar and host plants when we talk about butterflies. The larval host plants, they tend to be fairly specific to a given species of butterfly. So we all know about monarchs and milkweeds. So that's a very close association. But the monarch, they'll get nectar anywhere. They don't care. In terms of overwintering, it's much the same, only as bees, only butterflies will also overwinter in the egg stage. And I didn't mention this, but some bees overwinter as adults. So they stay hidden away in their nest cell. So the difference here is the eggs. And one thing I want to point out here is, how do you tell whether you have a butterfly or a moth? I think most of you know this, but one way is you look at the antennae, and forget about the ends out here. But if you look down along the main stem here, called the flagellum, you're going to see there's no hairs on here. But if you look closely at a moth, it's kind of hard to see, but they tend to be kind of brushy with hairs. And even if they're out in the day, right? Because we always think of moths as being evening. Well, this is a moth. And so look at the antennae. Now I want to talk a little bit about the threats that pollinators face, and many invertebrates for that matter. So the major threat, or one of two major threats, is habitat loss. We all know what this is. We know it when we see it. I'm not going to really talk about it because there's not really much to say, only that it's a really big factor in the decrease in the number of pollinators that are out there. Here's another form of habitat loss. Some of us may not recognize it immediately unless we think about it. And, why is this habitat loss? Well, because there's nothing there for pollinators. Okay, there's something here with a flower on it, but it's, maybe it's an ornamental rose and it's not of any value to pollinators. So we got to get rid of these green lawns and, replace them with other things. The second biggest threat are pesticides. Pesticides is an umbrella term. Now, a lot of times people talk about pesticides thinking insecticide, but it's bigger than that. It's insecticides, fungicides, herbicides, miticides, all kinds of sides that we have. And they're particularly problematic in urban landscapes, which may strike you as odd because, we always think of them being applied out in these big agricultural fields, and they are. But in urban landscapes, we use them a lot of times for cosmetic reasons. There's a couple of holes in a leaf and we say, oh my God, I think I'm going to go spray poison on every square inch of my yard. The problem is that stuff washes off. It can get on your kids. And that's a problem because if it washes off, it can get into waterways. And they've done studies, and in fact, there can be up to 10 times as much pesticide applied per acre in urban areas as in agricultural areas. And you should note that in the US, we apply over 1 billion pounds of pesticides a year. Some of these unintended consequences that we get from over-application. If you look at this as poison food sources. So we've got a swallowtail butterfly that might be eating a contaminated leaf. Down below, we've got an invertebrate that certainly has gotten into some bad water. And so these are problems that we've got to try to avoid. Back in 2013, you probably, some of you will remember this, during Pollinator Week, ironically, there was a problem down in Wilsonville, Oregon, at a big box store parking lot. There were linden trees, and they treated them with a systemic pesticide. Now, a systemic pesticide is something that they inject either into the tree itself or an application around the roots. The insecticide goes and gets into the actual tissues of the plant and can get up into the nectar and pollen. So there was a big bumblebee kill-off, and there's a conservative estimate that 140,000 bumblebees were killed because of this mishap. And no one broke any rules. They followed all the rules. And luckily what happened, a kind of silver lining, is that they've changed some of the rules around application of these neonics when it comes to linden trees in particular. So pesticides, you know, they are a toxic witch's brew. There's no better way to describe them. They did a study of native bees foraging around agricultural areas. 70% of them contained pesticides. And in total, looking at all the bees that they studied, there were 18 different pesticides. It's a crazy amount. One of the things about pesticides that we often don't consider, and many of us don't know about, are the sublethal effects. So, you know, you expose a bee to a pesticide and you think, well, it didn't kill it, so I guess that's okay. Well, no, that's not necessarily okay. There are various things that can happen: altered behavior, but not death. It can impact the reproductive success of a bee. It can cause them to grow more slowly. It can reduce their immune system response. And it even gets in the way of their foraging ability by impairing their learning, their ability to handle flowers, and even navigating back to the colony or nest site that they have. So, thing for you to remember, this is the safe amount of pesticides right there. Now, the last, not the last, the third threat is pathogens introduced species. So we look here on the left, we've got a honeybee, and sitting on that honeybee's thorax is a little mite called a varroa mite. And some of you may have heard this. And one of the things that it's doing is, well, it's sucking hemolymph out of this bee, but the bee's not too bothered by it. But they can carry something called a deformed wing virus. And what that does, and this is a bumblebee that's been exposed to this virus, is it causes the wings to end up looking like this. And I probably don't have to tell you that this bumblebee is not going to fly anywhere. Another problem is garlic mustard. This is something that we have in the area. You've got it there up around Portland, and we've got it down in South Oregon where I'm at. And very invasive. It's nasty for a number of reasons that I don't have time to talk about. We've got introduced predators. The European paper wasp, Pesticides, dominulus, is one of those. The problem, they just love eating our native caterpillars, and therefore they knock down our butterfly populations. And finally, we can end up in a situation where there's resource competition. If there aren't enough floral resources in a given area, then we can have problems. It doesn't happen very often, but it does happen. And the final threat then is climate change. And, you know, one of the things that we see with climate change is rain shifts. So when there's a tendency towards warming in an area, you know, a species is either going to have to move higher in altitude or higher in latitude in order to adapt. because it's happening, relatively quickly. And that seems easy enough, but we got to remember there has to be habitat to move through in order for that to happen. And if there's not a contiguous area that has suitable forage, well, they're not going to make it. So over several generations of bees, they've got to be able to move through these habitats. And if they're not there, then they can't move, and then they're going to have a problem. One of the things that happens is that we can change what's called phenology. Now, I'm going to use a phenology wheel here to show you an example of how this works. Phenology is when things happen. So when do flowers appear? When do bees emerge? Things like that. So in a normal situation, bees and flowers in sync. I'm going to start this wheel off, and we see the flowers blooming in the months. So this is January, February, March. And we're going to stop it here in May. And I want to point out on the left-hand side, it says floral suitability. So the bumblebee can forage on any of the yellow, red, or purple flowers, doesn't care. This little green bee here is a specialist bee, like the one I talked about earlier. And specialists can only use this orange flower. Okay, so the specialist pops up in May when the flower pops up. That's because they co-evolve together. Okay, it's not accidental timing. Then I'm just going to let this wheel finish out. And we can see that as long as the bumblebees are out, there's flowers, they're happy, specialist bees happy. So now what happens when they get out of sync? Let's say it's warmed up a little bit. So I start the wheel again. Well, I don't know if you noticed it before, but we didn't have a flower in January. And this time we do. I'm going to stop in May. And where's our little specialist at? Oh, okay. Here it comes. Now, let's look at what we have here. Where's the orange flower? Well, the orange flower is in April. Specialist bee came out in May because that's the way it evolved to come out. If it can only use the orange flower, what happens? Well, long story short is it dies. Okay, there's no nest, and that's the end of it. And, not to over dramatize, but this is a real problem. And luckily there are not very many of these specialist relationships that are that tight, but it's a very worrying situation. Now, another problem with warming can be overheating. Larger bees, they can really overheat if it's hot out. So typically bumblebees, you won't see them foraging if it's above 90 degrees, for instance. Higher temperatures can affect the amount of nectar and also the quality of the pollen. And then volatility in weather, which is one of the things that we see, right, with climate change, where you're swinging from dry to wet, crazy conditions. Well, organisms in general have a very difficult time dealing with that amount of volatility. So I want to show you here, if you're interested in taking a deeper dive on any of this stuff, this Solitary Bees book, if you want to be a solitary bee nerd, it is a really great book. It's technical, but accessible. And there's some fascinating stuff in here. Bumble Bees by Goulson, another book, it's technical, a lot of interesting information. If you like to learn maybe about identifying bees, this Bees in Your Backyard's very good. And then here's a couple of Xerces publications. Now we're going to take a 5-minute break, and we will start up again at 7:24. 7:24. So Elliot, I'm going to let you turn my video off.
Yep, no problem here. And do that. And
I'll be right back.
Okay.
And I would encourage anybody out there to get up, stretch your legs. I've been talking a long time, and I'm going to be talking at least as long again. just, give yourself a little chance to decompress.
And I encourage, to do that. And for anyone who's kind of still hanging around, I'll just add a couple things, a couple notes here. I just want to remind people that this presentation is being recorded and it will live on the Camas Public Library's YouTube page. Also, for those who have questions, we will have time for questions at the end of Dave's presentation. And you can ask those through the chat or through using the raise hand icon. Again, that'll happen at the end of Dave's presentation. I also want to say that for those in Camas, we do have some of these books that Dave just recommended, including Attracting Native Pollinators in our catalog. So I encourage you to come over to the Camas Public Library and check out some of these books. I will send a follow-up email to everyone who registered that has a link to the recording, as well as a link to a book list that we've come up with that has lots of books on pollinators, on native plants, and a lot of things that it ties into what Dave is talking about. I'll add one more thing while we're taking our break. Again, only for those who are still around. I encourage everyone to take a stretch or get a glass of water. But we also have an event later this month called Not Weeds, Northwest Roadside Wildflowers. That's going to be a presentation that is a co-presented with Naturescaping of Southwest Washington. It's presented by Mark Turner, who is a photographer, and he'll be talking about some native wildflowers that are that you can see from your car and that are in our area. So I'd encourage you to sign up for that event as well. Okay, I'll leave that. I'll stop there and let everyone continue on with their break, and we'll meet back up in just a moment.
Okay, Elliot, I'm back.
Okay, sorry, Dave, do you see that pop-up message asking you to start the video? Oh, there we go.
I was having trouble. I've got this laser pointer on, and I couldn't make my cursor hit that button.
Okay.
Anyway, okay. So let's go ahead and continue on. Technical difficulty here. There we go. Okay, so the next part of this is going to be talking about pollinator conservation, and the second half of this, and then at the end we'll talk about habitat assessment. And for pollinator conservation, we have basically 4 principles that we follow. The first of these are appropriate flowers and host plants, no pesticides, provide nesting, egg laying, and sheltering sites, and then finally, spread the word. So I want to note here beekeeping does not equal bee conservation. There's a number of good reasons why people keep bees, good hobby, but you're not doing anything to conserve native bees. And at best, a honeybee's impacts are neutral, okay? There's never gonna be a case where a honeybee is a good thing for a native bee, and there's instances where they're a bad thing for native bees. One of the main things is providing good habitat. If you think about it, three of the four principles had to do with this habitat. So good habitat, secure nest sites, flowers or foraging, and a pesticide-free environment. I want to talk about something called a habitat mosaic. I want you to think in terms of this. So a good habitat has many different aspects to it, and we're going to talk about that, but they don't have to all be in one place. So this bumblebee mosaic is made up of tiles, and these tiles are different bits of pollinator habitat that are in different locations that are, let's say, all close together. And in totality, they provide a good habitat. So these partial habitats or habitat mosaics, what they look like is something like this. So if we look here where my little laser pointer is, this is a ground nesting bee. And I'm not going to go through in detail because I really can't do that. But this is the loop that this bee makes. So the nest is here where the bee body is. And let's just, for instance, look at number 3. So what is the bee getting here at number 3? Well, there's some flowering shrubs there that the bee is using. Okay, and at number 7, what do we have for 7 here? Oh, it's a native bee lawn. So these houses, maybe not intentionally, but together, they're providing an adequate habitat for this bee. So you don't have to do it all yourself. In kind of urban and suburban areas, some of the things that are partial habitats, either to a greater or lesser extent, would be examples like these that I've got these pictures of. And I'm sure you're all familiar with settings like this. Now, so the first principle, appropriate flowers and host plants. What do we mean here? Well, one thing we need is forage patches. Plants are everywhere, but not all flowering plants actually help bees, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. What are you going to do when you go in and you say, oh, I want to make a change? Well, don't make changes that are going to go and cause less foraging habitat. In other words, if you're going to be making changes, retain what you have, create some new patches, and then if there's something you want to rip out, make sure you don't rip out more than what you've added. So you can at least have as much there. And always remember that locally native plants are better. And I'm going to say that over and over again. So when we look at plants, we've got all these choices to think about. The colors, the diversity we want. We don't want a real boring place. With a bloom period, are they spring, summer, fall? Are they natives or not natives? Are they drought tolerant? Maybe that's important for us. And then just our overall landscape context, which, that varies from person to person. Again, native is best. What we want you to do is provide bloom from late winter to late fall. And if we go from left to right, these, this is Oregon grape here. This is a willow of some kind. These are early spring. These are summer plants, pearly everlasting there. And then finally, we see some asters, some gumweed, and those are later fall kind of plants. Garden plants, exotic, some people call them, they're okay as long as they're providing a benefit to the bees. You want to look and see if the bees are using them, that's okay. Don't feel like you have to just rip them out first thing. Now, going back to what I said earlier about not all flowers are good for bees, we have got some flowers that are called double flowered. And this is an example here. What double flowered means is that breeders have selectively worked with natural mutations that cause some of the stamens in a plant to turn into petals. And the more of that they get, the fuller the head is with petals, which for some people that's a very pleasing thing. But it's not a pleasing thing for pollinators because either there's no pollen left or there's no way to get to whatever pollen is left. A couple of things I want to show here is butterfly bush and tropical milkweed. Just say no. Butterfly bush is on the most invasive list for the Pacific Northwest Pest Plant Council, also the native plant societies in Oregon and Washington. It is a larval host. Remember, that's the food that the caterpillars eat. So that's really important for survival. For only one of 725 butterfly species in the US. Why is that? Well, because it's not native to the US. Tropical milkweed, probably not a problem up in Washington, South Washington. I'm assuming this is South Washington, my geography might be out, but in Washington in general. Further south, say in California or warmer environments, these things can survive in the winter and they can pass a disease on to monarch butterflies. So they're really bad. If you use tropical milkweed, just make sure that they die to the ground over the winter. And if they don't, cut them off at the ground. They'll come back up. Something you can do to prolong your bloom, any of you gardeners will know this, is do deadheading. That will prolong bloom on a lot of plants. It can also help you avoid self-seeding if you're worried about that. One thing you should consider is, as you know you're getting to the end of your cycle, you can leave some of these there to provide seeds for overwintering birds. So something like a Rudbeckia is a good thing to keep. When you look at lawns, remember that big ugly green lawn that we saw earlier? This is an alternative. Now look how nice this is. Very natural, lots of little pollinator plants. These are from a company called PT Lawn Seed. And if you look at them, they've got just this enormous variety of seed packets that you can use for this kind of stuff. The other thing that you can do is apply what we call benign neglect. And this is an example. This is my yard. This is the time of year shown here in this picture. It's part of my yard where my wife doesn't really like it because I let this stuff go. There's a concern about the neighbors and, my response is always, I don't care about the neighbors. I'm worried about the bees. And in fact, this is just crawling with bumblebees and honeybees. And I wanted to point out about the docility of our bees. So bumblebees, which are colony nesters and in theory might be a little bit more aggressive. There was a bumblebee nest 2 years ago right here where my little pointer is. And I didn't even know it was there until well into the summer because, they don't make their presence known. They don't want to. So let's go to pesticides. We talked about them earlier, but from a conservation perspective. So again, avoid using them, but if you have to use them, minimize it. Read the guidance carefully. Don't over apply it. Don't want to be one of those urban idiots that puts out too much. But be warned that even if you follow the label instructions to the T, there's limited protection for native bees. And the reason is most of our natives are smaller than honeybees. These are tested on honeybees. That's the standard animal for testing pesticides. And what is okay for a honeybee is not necessarily okay for a native. If you're thinking, well, I'll just use organic. Oh, okay, stop for a minute. Organic pesticides are just as toxic as the others. The only good thing is that they happen to normally break down earlier. easier, quicker. Other than that, it's still poison. I want to go over some of the bee exposure pathways. Now, the first one's pretty obvious. If you've got a bee on a flower and you spray it. Not so obvious, contaminated nest material. So that leafcutter bee that we saw, what happens if it takes away a poison contaminated piece of leaf and puts it in the nest? Probably not going to be very good for the outcome of that particular nest cell. Indirect contact is, you spray, there's no bees around, you're real careful. But 10 minutes later, a bee shows up. How about these mining bees? It's easy to contaminate nest sites, especially if you don't know they're there. And then finally, going back to these neonicotinoids and other systemic insecticides, you can apply them to the ground and they get into the tissues, and the bees are either taking pollen or nectar, and that's a problem. One of the big offenders for these systemic pesticides are certain big box stores that have nursery sections. I know Home Depot and Lowe's are both committed to reducing that. I don't think they've gotten to zero yet. And the problem is that some of these neonicotinoids will remain in a plant for months or years, especially with woody plants. So when you go to your local nursery, always think to ask, are my plants treated with systemic insecticides? And if they say to you, well, I don't know, say, well, I'm not going to be buying your plants. Good stores follow the inputs of their customers. And if you let them know that you're really concerned, that you're concerned enough to walk away from a sale, then that will get them thinking about that. Why do we use pesticides? Well, for pests, right? So what can you do for prevention that doesn't involve pesticides? Try to create a resilient and diverse ecosystem in your yard, as is shown here in this picture. Most insects are beneficial. I think the pest, from the last thing I read, maybe 2% of insect species are actually pests. The rest are beneficials or neutral. Tolerate some plant damage. If you're missing some leaves, so what? If you've got milkweed that's got a bunch of stuff eaten off of it, that means you've got monarch butterfly caterpillars. If you've got bees with circles cut, or leaves with circles cut out of them, that means you've got some leafcutter bees. That's a good thing. Go native. Again, native. Natives have co-evolved with local pests. And what that means is that they've developed defenses to work against those pests. It's an evolutionary arms race. And it changes like most arms races do. But in general, natives are very successful with the local pest, otherwise they wouldn't survive. So the third principle was nesting, egg laying, and sheltering sites. And here, let's just look at some things. The top photo, these are snags. And what are snags? Why do we want those? Or remember, beetle holes and things like that are good for tunnel nesting bees. On the bottom, we see some bare ground. Bare ground is good for mining bees and other ground nesting bees. Sometimes, it's hard to, figure out, well, where am I going to get some bare ground? How do I do that? How do I incorporate it? Well, maybe you just need to get a little helper like I have. He helps me with my bare ground needs. He's always finding places to make some more bare ground. This picture shows an area about a square foot, and it's in my backyard. And these circles all show individual mining bee nests. So 1 square foot, 6 mining bee nests. Notice I don't have a lot of ground showing. I went and sprinkled a little bit of bark chips out, kind of make it look, you know, a little nice, but left plenty of little soil places where there's bare soil. For tunnel nesters, we want to try to pick some plants that have pithy stems, pithy meaning soft on the inside. You can see this hollow stem here. These are perfect for stem nesting bees. You know, so some of the plants are on this list here. I'm not going to run through that. You know, natural areas in your yard, if they fit, you know, they're always great. And then, you know, this is just an example of something that might be used in this particular type of opportunity. This is a little bee called a Serotina, which is a small carpenter bee. Nest blocks, these are things that you can get at your local nursery. If you can build your own very easily, just remember that the larger the hole you make, the deeper it has to be, because you want to make sure there's enough nest cells there, opportunity to build enough nest cells. You can use hollow stems. You know, sometimes I keep things from when I'm pruning, if it's an appropriate kind of a plant. And, or you can just buy, you know, bamboo or reed somewhere and build a little box like this. One thing to remember is you want to orient these things so that they're facing the east. That keeps them from getting too hot during the daytime. They warm up nicely in the morning sun though. Nest blocks really work. You can look at how they're blocked off to tell what's using them. Up above, we've got some leaf material, so we know that's a leaf cutter bee. Down below, there's some mud, and so we know there's a mason bee that's using that. These kind of nests will help more than bees. This piece of straw is being pulled in by a solitary wasp. These are really gentle little wasps. They eat insects. So, you know, they're helping you out, never going to bother you. Bumblebee nests are something that you can do, but I warn you that there's only, you know, typically about a 20% uptake on bumblebee nests. They're, you know, fun to do. I mean, you can, if you've got kids, you can build something like this and try it. I made them, you know, several years and never had any success, but I try not to give up. It's better to just make sure you've got some appropriate areas for them to find their own nest. Larval host plants, just want to go back to that. You know, they're going to be natives. They're going to be regionally specific, and they'll vary with the butterfly species. And you can have both larval and, both flowering and non-flowering host plants. So some butterflies like skippers, they actually use grasses. For those that really have an interest in butterflies, I just want to mention this organization, Butterflies and Moths in North America, BMONA. You can Google that and find out more. But one of the neat things about this website is that you can select your county, which I've done here, and it will give you a list of butterflies that are on record in your county. And then if you click on one of these, as in this case, the Western Tiger Swallowtail, it'll show you a lot of information, and it will actually somewhere here gives you the host plants. Yeah, caterpillar hosts. So this is, you know, a pretty cool little tool. Leave the leaves. This is a Xerces campaign. They're good to keep down, as I said about when I was talking about bumblebee queens, from fall through the spring, if you can handle that, or at least into the spring. And good for bees, butterflies, and other invertebrates. Now, we don't expect you to have, you know, this in the back of your yard, but this is just here to show you that, you know, the little tiny places that are really important for certain types of invertebrates. There are things that we don't really think about a lot of times unless we, you know, get down on our knees and pay some attention and sit and look for a while. One thing you can do also is provide a water source. It's not as important, but it's a nice thing to have as an extra. Bees certainly use water now and then. Some butterflies like to do puddling. They can get minerals that way. And the final thing was spread the word. You know, I'm spreading the word right now. You don't have to do that. You don't have to give presentations, but you can get involved in other ways. You put up, you know, pollinator habitat signs, etc. You can become an advocate for pollinators and, you know, talk to your neighbors and things like that. You can learn about X-Kids. If you've got younger kids, I would really think you should try looking at this. This is kind of a 3 to 5 grade, but the program's been very successful, and it's actually being used by older kids in that. I mean, it's got a lot of neat activities that you can do and document outside in your yard or some park or something like that. You can get involved in community science. Now, these are all projects that are under the umbrella of Xerces Society, the Western Monarch Milkweed Mapper, Bumblebee Watch is something that's kind of fun to do. Pacific Northwest Bumblebee Atlas, it's a little bit more involved. That's one of the atlases I work with. You actually go out and do scientific surveys. And then there's the Western Monarch Count. Oops, sorry, I went too far. And then there's this Bring Back the Pollinators. You can take a pledge. You can go to bringbackthe-pollinators.org and sign the pledge to do the things that are listed here, which are basically the 4 principles that I talked about earlier. Now, I want to talk a little bit about home habitat assessment. I think I've got enough time to go through this fairly well. I know we're, you know, moving fast, but just, you know, bear with me here. Xerces has a guide, habitat assessment guide, and I'm going to show you how to get to that. And you can download this. And it's really valuable. It's got a lot of great information. And most importantly, it provides a way for you to categorize and grade your own habitat. And just to go briefly over it, and then we're going to get into a little bit more depth. There's a score sheet for your site, and that score sheet's based on foraging habitat, nesting and overwintering habitat, pesticide practices, and then finally community action. And the grading process goes something like this. So you look at different things, for instance, the percentage of the site that's covered in flowering vegetation. And the photos here give you a guide to kind of judge that. You know, we're not building rockets here, so you don't have to be precise. What you have to do is use the same methods and the same estimates when you go from year to year so that you can make an accurate comparison. Another thing we're looking at is percentage of flowering vegetation that's native, things like that. We look at native wildflower plantings. Do you have a bee lawn? Do you have woody or shrubby areas? What kind of native ground covers do you have? There's a section for bloom coverage. We talked about this. So this little chart here is something that I made up in Excel, and I use this. This is actually just a little screenshot of a section of my own chart. I use this to kind of give me a idea of what my bloom coverage is. And you can do this, you know, you can just draw up a grid on a piece of paper and pencil in the months and the flowers that you have and put X's in the squares. You don't have to have color. But if we look here, this is this spring, right? I've got good coverage. This is summer, got great coverage there. And that's good because that's when everything's really jumping. And then even in the fall, there's good coverage. So one of the items that's listed in this assessment guide is the table of super plants, superfoods and host plants. And there's symbols here that show you, some little icons that show you what these mean. But these plants that have got 3 of those icons mean that they're a superfood, they're a larval host plant, and they're also a good food for specialist bees. And so remember those specialist bees that can have a problem. And just as one example, this is Grandelia or gumweed. And you can see that it's a superfood. So if you put these in your yard, you get a certain amount of points up here. And that's part of the scoring. Let's look at nesting and overwintering. What you're going to be graded on is unmown areas, patchy or bare ground, native bunch grasses, leaf litter treatment. Do you leave it or not? Also pruning practices and other things related to that, use of rocks in the landscape, because some things like to get under the rocks and hide. As far as pesticides go, these are pretty straightforward. They're mostly yes and no kind of things. You either get the points or you don't. And then finally, there's a section on community action. And that's really, what are you doing to be an advocate for pollinators? Because, although it's great that you're here listening to this presentation, and it'd be, even better if you do something in your own yard, the best outcome still, or better outcome still, is if you go and get other people to do stuff like this. So after you go through all that, you end up with this, putting your scores in here, and you end up with this final overall score. And what you can do then is, that's your starting point. And there is a check in that guide. There's a checklist of actions that you can use to promote pollinators. And these are things that can be added that will allow you to increase your scores, or you can just look at what you had a low score on. But what we want to get you to think about is this habitat improvement cycle, okay? You do this initial assessment. Hopefully that gets you to go and think about some changes you can make to make it better. You go and make those changes, and then maybe next year in the spring or over the winter or whatever, you go and do another assessment, right? And you try to get in this loop of, am I getting better? You certainly want to make sure that you're not losing ground. Now, the way you find this is you go to the Xerces website, and on the top, on the homepage of the Xerces website, you're going to see this little ribbon up here, and one of these is going to say resources. And if you pull down, you're going to say Pollinator Conservation Resource Center. And in there, you can go and select a region like the Pacific Northwest. And you've got all these categories here: habitat assessment, plant list, on and on, native seed and plant vendors. If you click on these, each one of these have got a list of things. So for instance, you can find buying bee safe plants. How do you go about doing that? What are some things you should know about nesting and overwintering habitat? And here's this assessment guide that I was talking about up here. So all these things are downloadable from the Xerces website, and it's just a great resource. All you have to remember, go to xerces.org, and you'll find this stuff. These are some books by the Cersei Society. You've seen one of them or two of them already. Another great book is 100 Plants to Feed the Bees. It covers the whole US, but there are some regional elements to that. And any of the plants in there are good bee plants, even if they're not native to our region. Another thing, if you do any farming or associated with that, is farming with native beneficial insects, about biological pest control. We would encourage you to connect with the Xerces Society. If you are using social media, you can find us on Facebook, Twitter. I'm not a big social media person, so I think that's Instagram or something. And then YouTube. Finally, we are a donor-supported nonprofit. We'd love to have new members. So if you feel like you want to or are able to, you could always welcome donations, but you don't have to. And in fact, if you go to the Xerces website, you can sign up for a free newsletter that comes out and get on that mailing list. And that is the end of the presentation. So now I'm open to any questions.
Yeah, and just want to remind everyone that if you have a question, there's a couple ways you can ask it. You can type your message into the chat, and then I can read it aloud. Or if you'd like to ask your question aloud, you can use the raise hand icon at the bottom of your Zoom window. And right before the break, there was a question that popped up in the chat about which I think you spoke about with the habitat assessment, but about what is the most beneficial plant to add to our garden for bees. And open question, but maybe just want to go.
Yeah. So okay. So yeah. So let me just comment on that. So if you remember, I'm just going to go back here real quick. This is what you got to get. Print this page out. Go download that guide and print this page out. So we're in the Pacific Northwest. Okay. Here's a list, and go for the ones that have got 3. These up here are broken down into wildflowers, shrubs and trees, and grasses. And these are, they're not specific, but they're appropriate for most regions, right? So you can look at this list. And so these are, tons of great plants. And, this is a really vetted list. Remember, Xerces has been doing this for 50 years. So, there's a lot of knowledge that goes into this list. And so this is a great place to go ahead and start thinking about plants to add.
And then the person who asked that said, thank you very much. I'll check the list before heading to the nursery. Have a question. How bad is spot treatment with Roundup to pollinators?
Okay. Answer, how bad is spot treatment?
With Roundup to pollinators.
Okay. So, well, the reality is that stuff goes away pretty quickly. And if you can make sure that you don't have, say, mining bee nest where you're treating, and you're not spraying flowers, like go down to the base of the plant where there's much less likelihood of something getting that. It's probably not too bad. I mean, I use it in my driveway once in a while because I just don't have got a couple of cracks and there's just no other way to do it. But I know that those are not going to be involving pollinators in any way. The main reason I don't like it is Roundup's got some things that last that can get into runoff and into the waterways. And it's also the active ingredients, not the problem. It's the stuff that's the active ingredients is mixed with is also carcinogenic. So don't get the stuff on your hands. But if you must use a little bit, just be careful and it's probably okay.
I want to say too that when I send out the follow-up email to all those who registered, I'll put a link to the resource page that you highlighted.
Oh, well, that's a good idea. Yeah, that's a good idea.
And if there's anyone that had any other questions, again, feel free to ask in the chat or use the raise hand icon.
Everybody's too tired.
Oh, well, we've had a number of comments to say thank you so much for the presentation. Well,
okay, well, listen, I've enjoyed it. Let's keep the pollinators pollinating.
Absolutely, and thank you so much, Dave. We really appreciate it. Second event with us, and just every time it's been wonderful. So thank you so much. And thank you all for coming tonight, and be on the lookout for that follow-up email for those resources. All right. Okay, have a good evening, everyone.
Okay.
All right.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye.